it was an ordinary day, and the flight from Atlanta to Chicago proceeded like any other. Inside the cabin, people were finding their seats, stowing luggage in the overhead bins, and settling in for the journey. Amid the murmurs and the sound of rolling suitcases, Karen Parker boarded the plane, standing out in an extravagant designer blouse so flashy it was hard to ignore, with large sunglasses perched on her head. Her demeanor exuded self-importance as she strolled, her eyes scanning each passenger as if appraising them one by one. Karen, in her early 40s, was used to attention and deference. For her, everything had to go her way, and anything otherwise often left her irritated. She sauntered down the aisle as if she owned the plane itself. The other passengers were mere background figures, unworthy of her attention. Not far behind her was Michael Anderson, a tall, sturdy man dressed in a crisply ironed police uniform. Michael moved with calm confidence, a quiet composure radiating from his gentle gestures. His steady gaze swept over the passengers, not to judge, but simply as a habitual observation. As a respected officer in the community, Michael was known for his calm demeanor, dedication, and courage. He wasn't one to seek trouble, but he was ready to confront it if necessary. He understood he was here just to travel from point A to point B, and all he wanted was a peaceful flight. Karen paused when she found her row. She turned around, her eyes meeting Michael's calm gaze as he prepared to take the seat beside her. A flash of discomfort crossed Karen's face as she realized she'd have to sit next to someone she deemed beneath her. She squinted her eyes, a disdainful smirk playing on her lips, and reluctantly turned toward Michael. Michael, courteous as always, gave her a slight smile and stepped aside, allowing her to take her seat by the window. However, Karen mumbled something about respect and personal space and hurried past him without acknowledging his greeting. Michael heard her murmur but chose not to respond. He knew that engaging with provocations would only lead to unnecessary conflict. Once everyone was seated and the plane took off, Karen grew increasingly displeased that Michael remained silent. Showing no reaction to her presence, she began muttering, deliberately loud enough for Michael to hear, making snide comments about people who don't belong here. Each time she mentioned the phrase, she cast a loaded glance at Michael. She wanted to make it clear that she didn't want him seated next to her. Michael pretended not to hear. He tried focusing on the book in his hands, turning each page calmly, though he could feel the tension radiating from Karen's gaze. He knew that responding would only worsen the situation, and he didn't want to create a scene. The passengers around them had started noticing Karen's evident irritation, glancing discreetly in their direction. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others sighed in exasperation. Moments later, the uncomfortable silence was broken by Karen's loud, mocking voice. She spoke up, seemingly intent on making sure the surrounding passengers heard her. "I just don't understand why some people can't stay in their place. Don't you agree, officer?" Michael looked up, surprised by her audacity. His eyes briefly scanned Karen's face, and he responded calmly, his voice steady yet respectful. "I'm just here to take this flight, ma'am, like everyone else." Karen gave a derisive laugh, her sharp gaze filled with disdain. "Oh? People like you think you can go anywhere, do anything, and take up space like you belong here?" Karen's words were not only disrespectful but also blatantly discriminatory. Michael suppressed the anger rising within him, maintaining his composure. He knew that engaging with her would serve no good purpose, though her attitude deeply unsettled him. Karen leaned closer to Michael, her tone soft but laced with mockery. "Tell me, is this your first time on a plane, officer? Do you even know the proper way to behave on a flight?" Her question felt like a direct provocation. Michael clenched his teeth, struggling to remain calm. He knew that silence and restraint were his best options to avoid giving Karen the satisfaction she sought. Still, every word she spoke seemed like a jab at his self-respect. Some passengers had already turned to look, while others whispered amongst themselves in disbelief at what was unfolding. Michael felt the weight of their eyes on him, but he was determined not to escalate this into a larger conflict. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am," he replied evenly, maintaining his calm demeanor. "I'm just hoping for a peaceful flight." Karen rolled her eyes in clear contempt. "Peaceful? Please, I've seen people like you cause all kinds of trouble. I bet if anything goes wrong on this plane, you'll be the first to blame someone else, right?" Michael's heart started to race. He realized that this conversation was pushing him to the limit of his patience, yet he kept his calm. Karen's behavior was increasingly outrageous, and her subtle hostility made it challenging for him to keep silent. But Karen didn't stop. She eyed his uniform and sneered. "You think that uniform means something, don't you? I bet they're just handing those out to anyone these days without a thought for who deserves it." Michael took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. He recalled the training he had received throughout his years as an officer. Patience and composure were true strengths. Yet, at that moment, Karen's contemptuous gaze felt like a smoldering flame, threatening to ignite his pride, making him feel the urge to respond. However, he resolved not to let her win by provoking him into a reaction. Michael understood that nothing would please someone like Karen more than seeing others fall into the trap of her provocations. Karen's contempt for Michael became more evident, as if his very presence was an offense to her. From her initial muttered complaints, she shifted to more overt mockery, hoping to provoke some reaction from him. Michael could sense the provocation in her voice, but he merely closed his eyes, trying to focus on the book in his hands as though he hadn't heard her. But Karen wasn't about to let it go. She leaned toward Michael, her tone dripping with sarcasm, loud enough for others around to hear. "Unbelievable. They let anyone on a plane nowadays without any proper checks. Some people think that just by wearing a uniform they can move freely in places like this." Michael took a deep breath, reminding himself that this wasn't the first time he'd faced such blatant prejudice. A memory surfaced from years ago when he was still a young cop. One late night, while patrolling a quiet street, a group of white teenagers approached him, looking at him with hostility. One of them sneered, "You think you're doing something here, officer? That uniform doesn't make you any different. You're still just a leech." Those insults haunted him for years, but also became a driving force, making him stronger and more resilient against ridicule. Karen's provocative voice snapped him back to the present. He tried to remain calm, turning a page in his book, but his hands began to clench, his knuckles turning white. He knew that Karen wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted, a reaction from him. Karen continued, her voice mocking as she looked Michael up and down as though he didn't deserve to be there. "Do you think sitting there in silence is going to make me stop? People like you think you can just blend in, but nobody here wants to see you." Each of Karen's words felt like a knife cutting into Michael's self-respect. He knew that responding would only complicate things further, but his pride was starting to stir. He remembered another incident when he'd been refused service at a restaurant after a long, exhausting shift. That day, he walked into the place, just wanting a warm meal, but the server looked him up and down and coldly said, "Sorry, we don't serve here." The smirks of the other diners, the server's disdainful tone, they were etched into his memory. He hadn't said anything and quietly left, but his determination was strengthened through such experiences. Back in the airplane cabin, Michael stared straight ahead, reminding himself not to let Karen see any anger or discomfort in his eyes. But Karen wouldn't relent. Her voice grew louder, as if everyone around her heard her. She sighed mockingly. "This must be your first time on a plane, right, officer? Just by the way you're sitting, I can tell you don't know the first thing about proper conduct here." A middle-aged woman nearby looked at Michael with sympathy, while some other passengers sighed and shook their heads. They weren't sure how to react, but it seemed they recognized the injustice Michael was enduring. He felt his chest tighten, but he still tried to keep his composure. He reminded himself that he had faced people like Karen before, and that he could endure this too. Another memory surfaced, of a night when a driver refused to give him a ride when he urgently needed to get to a case. The driver had glanced briefly at his skin color before muttering something and speeding away, leaving him standing alone on a dark road. It was moments like those that reminded him that his job required not just physical strength but also resilience. Memories like these were why he chose silence and composure, refusing to let Karen see she was testing his patience. But Karen didn't stop. She leaned in closer, her gaze sharp and her smile filled with scorn. "Do you think you can sit here unnoticed? People like you are nothing but troublemakers. If anything happens, I'm sure you'd be the first to cause a scene, right?" Michael gritted his teeth, suppressing the irritation rising inside him. He reminded himself that silence was the strongest response to people like Karen, but her words were like a small fire, igniting his sense of pride. He knew that if he weren't a police officer, a representative of the law, he might not be able to keep his calm in this situation. Karen's voice rang out again, this time with a tone that suggested she wanted everyone else to share in her disdain. "I don't understand why they allow people like you to sit here. A uniform doesn't make you different. You're still just someone who doesn't belong here." Karen's words were laced with bitterness, but Michael kept his gaze fixed forward, maintaining a calm expression. He realized that each of her words was no different from the times he had been denied service or looked down upon in the past. But those moments were also when he reminded himself that he had to be stronger, to elevate his dignity. He wouldn't let her win. A few passengers nearby couldn't help but look at Karen with indignation, while others simply sighed in exasperation. They could sense the tension between the two, but no one seemed willing to intervene. To them, Karen was merely displaying her overbearing arrogance, while Michael was the embodiment of patience and resilience. Despite the increasing tension, Michael kept his calm, determined not to let her know that each of her words was a challenge to his self-respect. He knew Karen was hoping he'd lose control, giving her a reason to continue her taunts, but Michael was resolved not to let that happen. He wouldn't let people like Karen win by causing him to lose his composure and dignity. When the plane landed in Chicago, Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, he thought he could escape Karen's relentless hostility. He let other passengers disembark first and stayed back for a while, hoping to avoid a confrontation with her. But deep down, he still felt uneasy, as if the matter wasn't truly over. After disembarking and reaching the baggage claim area, Michael tried to blend into the crowd. He just wanted to retrieve his luggage and leave the airport peacefully. But as he glanced around, he noticed Karen's familiar figure. She stood on the other side of the baggage claim, her cold, determined gaze fixed on him, no different from before. Michael sighed, trying to keep calm, but her presence made him uncomfortable. Shortly after, Karen began to walk toward him, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor, the sound echoing through the bustling airport. Her eyes held a fierce hatred, and each step seemed to carry an invisible pressure. Michael felt a sense of unease rises within him, but he decided to maintain his composure, knowing that any reaction he gave might only provide her with a pretext to escalate her harassment. When Karen was only a few steps away, she loudly called out for airport security. "I need assistance here. Is anyone around?" she cried, her voice filled with feigned panic. A security officer quickly approached, looking between Karen and Michael with a worried expression. "What's going on, ma'am?" he asked. Karen pointed at Michael, her eyes alight with resolve. "This man has been harassing me throughout the flight. I feel unsafe with him around. He's been staring at me, and I'm afraid he might do something dangerous." Michael looked directly at the security officer, keeping his expression calm and clear, though he felt a sinking feeling at this unfounded accusation. He calmly explained, "I'm just here to pick up my luggage, like everyone else. I have no intention of bothering her or anyone else." The security officer looked slightly puzzled, glancing between Michael and Karen. But instead of de-escalating, Karen continued, her voice growing sharper and colder. "Unacceptable," she spat, her eyes blazing with anger. "Do you think you can go wherever you please and do whatever you want just because you wear a police uniform?" The officer seemed more uncomfortable, but Michael remained calm, explaining, "I'm just here to get my luggage and leave the airport. Nothing more." Suddenly, a different look flashed in Karen's eyes. It was as if her words stemmed from something more than mere frustration with a stranger. The hatred in her gaze grew deeper, more personal. At that moment, Michael began to realize that Karen didn't just see him as a black man or a police officer. She seemed to carry her unresolved feelings about people in uniform. Karen turned back to the security officer, her voice thick with drama. "You know, this man reminds me of someone I used to know. A man who abused his power, thinking he could control everyone around him just because he wore a uniform. He made my life hell, and now I have to endure the threat of someone like him on my flight." Michael was stunned, feeling as if he had been dragged into a complex story he had nothing to do with. Karen's words were more than simple racial prejudice. There was something personal, something deeper that made her look at him with such hatred and resentment. Perhaps she had suffered in the past from a relationship with someone in law enforcement, and now she was projecting all that pain onto him, seeing him as a symbol of her past trauma. Karen continued, her tone growing increasingly bitter. "People like you," she said, staring straight at Michael, "are all the same. Arrogant, power-hungry, thinking you can do anything just because you wear a uniform. Do you think that just because you're a cop, no one will dare to stand up to you?" Michael took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He had heard criticism, even hostility from others about his work before, but this was the first time he felt he had been dragged into such a deeply personal, bitter story. He understood that Karen didn't just see him as a police officer. To her, he represented the pain and disappointment she had once experienced. The security officer glanced at Michael, looking for reassurance that the situation wouldn't spiral out of control. Michael nodded slightly, signaling his full cooperation, and spoke in a steady tone. "I understand that you have your personal feelings, ma'am, but I haven't done anything to harm you. I just want to retrieve my luggage and go." Karen smirked, giving a contemptuous laugh. "People like you always say that, but I know your type well. You can pretend to be kind, but inside, you're all about threats and control." Michael looked at her, feeling a mix of emotions. He knew that she didn't truly hate him, She hated the image he represented, the figure of someone connected to her pain. But that didn't lessen the bitterness in her words or make him feel any less hurt. Nevertheless, he chose to stay silent, knowing that any response would only make the situation more complicated. Finally, the security officer turned to Karen, attempting to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, I don't think it's necessary to escalate this. If you feel unsafe, we can ensure that you won't have to stand near each other at the baggage claim." Karen paused, her gaze still filled with hatred toward Michael, but eventually nodded in agreement. Michael felt relieved as the officer guided her away, allowing him to retrieve his luggage without further harassment. But before leaving, Karen gave him one last icy, hate-filled look and whispered threateningly, "We're not done. I'll make sure someone like you pays the price." Michael only nodded, maintaining his calm exterior, but he knew that this confrontation wouldn't end there. He wondered just how deep Karen's past wounds ran, to make her pour all of her hatred and blame onto a stranger simply because he wore a police uniform. With one final look, Karen walked away, leaving Michael standing there with a flood of thoughts. He realized that this encounter was not just about him and Karen. It was about her unhealed wounds, and his patience had to be strong enough to withstand the misplaced anger directed at him through no fault of his own. Michael breathed a sigh of relief, thinking he'd finally be able to leave the airport and escape Karen's relentless harassment. But as he stepped into the airport waiting area, he stopped abruptly, sensing that someone was watching him. Turning around, he noticed a man in a black suit approaching him. The man had a professional, cold demeanor with a cautious expression. "Hello, are you Officer Anderson?" the man asked, his voice low and serious. Michael nodded, eyeing the stranger warily. "Yes, that's me. Is there a problem?" The man extended his hand, introducing himself politely. "I'm Jason Pendant from Parker Security, a private protection firm. We just received a special request from one of our clients, Mrs. Karen Parker. She's hired us to protect her from you." Michael was taken aback, struggling to believe what he had just heard. Had Karen gone so far as to hire a private security firm just to continue harassing him? She was weaving a fictional story about a threat from him, even though he had done nothing to intimidate her. He felt as though he was being pulled into a complex plot, with the situation growing stranger by the moment. "So, you're telling me she's hired you to protect her from me? A police officer on duty?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with skepticism, though he maintained his composure. Pendant nodded, his expression emotionless. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Parker has claimed you are a threat and requested that we monitor you to protect her. Although we haven't seen any evidence that you've done anything wrong, as a company, we're obliged to follow our clients' requests." Michael clenched his teeth, struggling to keep calm, though he felt a surge of frustration. It was clear that Karen had no intention of letting him go, and she was determined to paint him as the villain in her imagined story. He understood that this wasn't merely a direct attack on his dignity, but a threat to his reputation that he had spent years building. Pendant met Michael's gaze, seeming to understand the injustice he was facing. He spoke with a calm voice, laced with a hint of empathy. "Actually, I find this situation odd as well. This isn't the first time Mrs. Parker has hired us for similar requests. We've handled several protection requests from her that lacked any clear reason, but as a company, we have to comply with our clients' requests." Michael nodded, but he couldn't hide his sense of disappointment and dismay. Karen wasn't just a hostile person. She was constructing a malicious story with the intent of tarnishing his reputation. She wanted to make him appear dangerous, crafting a narrative of a threat to garner sympathy and simultaneously destroy the image he had worked so hard to uphold. "Pendant, I understand you're just doing your job," Michael said, his tone steady, "but I want to make it clear that I have done nothing to threaten or endanger Mrs. Parker. Everything she's saying is a lie." Pendant nodded, looking at Michael with a knowing expression. "I understand, Officer Anderson. I can see that. It seems Mrs. Parker wants to prolong this incident, turning it into a big story to put pressure on you." Michael closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He couldn't believe Karen would go to such lengths. Not content with the insults and harassment on the plane, she had now created a drama to smear his character and destroy his reputation. This wasn't just about his job, it could also affect his personal life. But as a police officer, he knew he had to remain calm and not let his emotions complicate the situation further. Pendant handed Michael a business card, his tone softer. "If anything comes up, feel free to reach out to me. I don't believe Mrs. Parker's story, but we have to fulfill our client's requests." Michael took the card, nodding appreciatively at Pendant's professionalism and respect. "Thank you, Pendant. I only hope she realizes soon that this is only harming both of us." Pendant nodded, then turned to leave. But before he walked away, he paused, looking back at Michael with a serious expression. "Officer Anderson, I don't know much about Mrs. Parker's past, but I feel there's something personal behind her actions towards you. Perhaps she went through something difficult and is projecting it all onto you." Michael was silent, reflecting on Pendant's words. It reminded him of the times Karen had alluded to her past with bitterness, as though he was somehow the cause of the pain she had endured. Though he didn't know the details, he suspected she may have been hurt in the past by someone in security or law enforcement, and now she was targeting him as a symbol of that suffering. He felt a twinge of sympathy, but he still couldn't accept her baseless accusations and the injustice she was inflicting. As Pendant left, Michael stood for a moment, trying to steady himself. He realized that this confrontation with Karen wouldn't end easily. She had no intention of letting him go, and seemed willing to do whatever it took to prolong the harassment and damage him in the way she desired. But Michael knew he had to stay strong, more resilient than ever, to protect his honor and reputation. He gripped the business card tightly, feeling as though an internal battle was raging within him. He reminded himself that he wouldn't let Karen destroy everything he had worked to build, and if she continued to escalate, he would be ready to face her with integrity and professionalism. Deep down, Michael understood that Karen wasn't just an angry woman. She was orchestrating a calculated plan to turn him into an enemy, a threat to her life. And, as a police officer, he knew that this fight wasn't only about defending his dignity, but about proving that he would never let this injustice continue. With newfound determination, Michael left the airport, knowing this was just the beginning of a long and challenging confrontation. A few days after the airport incident, Michael was assigned to a charity gala, where he would be responsible for security. This event was an opportunity for police officers and community members to connect and raise funds for youth support programs, Michael hoped. The event would allow him to temporarily forget the recent tensions and immerse himself in the positive energy of the community he was proud to serve. However, upon entering the grand hall, he unexpectedly spotted a familiar face in the crowd, Karen Parker. She stood among a group of guests looking glamorous in an elegant black dress, wearing a smug smile. When she saw Michael, her expression instantly changed. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by hatred and disdain. Michael felt tension spread through the air as if a storm was about to break. He tried to remain calm, reminding himself that this was a charity event and his duty was to ensure everything ran smoothly. But Karen had no intention of letting him be. She quietly made her way toward him, her eyes glinting with a troubling intensity. "Oh, what a coincidence, Officer Anderson," Karen said, her voice sweet but laced with sarcasm. "Who would have thought you'd be here, in a place meant for people who truly matter in the community?" Michael maintained his calm, responding evenly, "I'm just here to do my job, Ms. Parker. Everyone is welcome to participate and contribute to the community." Karen smirked, her tone turning icy. "Oh, of course, someone like you would be very skilled at contributing," she said loudly enough that a few nearby guests turned to look, confused by her overt hostility. It was clear she wasn't just trying to humiliate him. She was drawing others' attention, attempting to make him a target of her disdain. Michael could feel the curious and somewhat unsettled gazes of those around him. He knew that everything he did or said would be scrutinized. He reminded himself to stay composed, knowing that losing his temper was exactly what Karen wanted. At that moment, a deep, authoritative voice called out from behind him. "Is there a problem here?" It was Michael's supervisor, Lieutenant Stephen Williams, a man with a stern demeanor known for his fairness and understanding. Williams had attended the gala by chance and had witnessed the confrontation. Karen turned to Williams, trying to look innocent, but her eyes still gleamed with hostility. "Sir, I was just trying to warn everyone about a potential threat. He's been harassing me all week, and I don't think someone like him belongs in a place like this." Williams listened, then looked at Michael, who remained composed despite the tense situation. "Michael, do you have anything to say?" he asked. Michael nodded slightly, replying in a calm but firm tone. "Sir, I'm just here on duty. I have no intention of bothering Ms. Parker or anyone else. Her accusations are completely unfounded." Williams regarded Karen for a moment before speaking calmly yet firmly. "Miss Parker, I understand you have the right to feel uncomfortable, but accusations should be supported by clear evidence. Officer Anderson has an outstanding record and is respected by the community. I suggest you remain calm and refrain from turning this evening into a personal confrontation." Caught off guard by Williams's stern response, Karen struggled to maintain her composure, but her anger was becoming more apparent. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for Michael so publicly. Her eyes flashed with anger as she realized the onlookers were starting to view her with less sympathy. Williams continued, his tone softening but remaining serious. "Michael, you have nothing to worry about. We know who you are and what you've done for this community. You have supporters who respect you, and I won't let anyone damage your reputation unjustly." Michael nodded gratefully, feeling a renewed sense of strength. He knew that no matter what Karen tried, he had colleagues and supervisors willing to protect and support him. This wasn't just a source of encouragement. It was proof of the value of patience and resilience he had maintained throughout this challenging time. Undeterred, Karen raised her voice, trying to rally support from the surrounding crowd. "Do you all see this? We're paying people like him to protect us, yet they make us feel unsafe. How frightening!" Williams didn't let her continue. He spoke, each word resonating with authority. "Ms. Parker, if you're uncomfortable, we can arrange for you to leave the event. Otherwise, I ask that you show respect to the other guests, especially those here on duty like Officer Anderson." Karen froze, her words cut short by Williams's intervention. She seemed to realize that those around her were growing increasingly impatient with her behavior. Some guests shook their heads quietly, others looked visibly displeased. She recognized that she had failed to turn the crowd against Michael. Michael felt a sense of relief as he saw the support not only from Williams but also from those around him. He understood that people like Karen would always try to harm others, but with the solidarity and support of his colleagues and community, he could overcome anything. Williams placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder, speaking softly. "Keep doing your job well, Michael. Don't let people like her shake your resolve. Your patience and dignity are valued, and you'll always have people standing behind you." Michael smiled gratefully and returned to his duties, feeling reinvigorated by the support from his colleagues and the solidarity of the community he served. He knew the confrontation with Karen might not be entirely over, but he found strength in his patience and the backing of those around him, which would help him face any challenges ahead. Karen, flustered by Williams's intervention, retreated to a corner of the gala hall. She knew she hadn't achieved her goal tonight. Yet, with a gleam of arrogance and scheming in her eyes, she muttered under her breath, "We'll meet again, Officer Anderson." Michael heard her vague threat, but this time he felt a calmness within. He knew he wouldn't be alone in this fight, and no matter how hard Karen tried, he wouldn't let her tarnish his honor or his pride. After days of intense work, Michael thought the ordeal with Karen had come to an end. However, during a routine night shift at the airport, he encountered the woman who had caused him so much trouble once more. Karen appeared in the crowd, and she seemed to recognize him immediately. Her eyes glinted with calculation and determination, and Michael knew she wouldn't let things go easily this time. A sense of foreboding filled him. Michael took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He tried to step back and focus on his duties, hoping she wouldn't start anything. But Karen seized the opportunity, approaching as if she'd only accidentally noticed him. Yet her loud voice quickly drew the attention of those around them. "Oh, look who we have here," she said mockingly, clearly intending for everyone to hear. "This cop is stalking me everywhere. Is this how the police serve the public? Following, intimidating, and harassing innocent citizens in public spaces." Several passengers stopped to watch, their curiosity piqued. Michael could feel dozens of eyes on him, and he knew Karen was trying to make him appear as the villain. He kept his voice steady as he replied, "Miss Parker, I am just here on duty. If you're uncomfortable, you're free to move to another area." Karen sneered, the contempt in her eyes sharpening every word she said. "You say that as if I'm the problem. You're abusing your power to threaten me, and I won't let this go. Everyone, look. This is how people like him use their uniforms to manipulate and control." Michael could feel anger building within him, but he knew he couldn't let emotions take over. Karen's baseless accusations and contempt weren't just hurtful, they were an affront to his dignity. He knew that any overreaction on his part would only worsen the situation, and this was the critical moment. The moment he had to prove his patience and professionalism. At that point, an airport security guard approached, looking warily between Michael and Karen. He politely asked, "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" Karen immediately turned to the guard, seizing the chance to make a public accusation. "I want to report this. This officer is harassing and threatening me. I demand immediate intervention to protect me from him." Michael remained calm, looking at the guard with honesty and saying, "I'm just here doing my duty. I have no intention of approaching or harassing Ms. Parker." The guard glanced between Michael and Karen, trying to assess the situation. Sensing his hesitation, Karen continued to escalate the drama, her voice becoming more outraged. "He's been following me since the charity gala. I can't escape his stalking, and now I have to endure his threats right here at the airport." Michael stayed silent, letting the guard make his judgment. He knew the truth was on his side, and if he held his ground, the situation would resolve itself. Just then, some nearby passengers who had been observing everything started to speak up. A middle-aged woman who had been watching from the start stepped forward with a determined expression. "Sir," she addressed the guard, her voice filled with indignation, "I've seen it all. This officer hasn't done anything wrong. It's the woman who's been causing trouble from the beginning." Another man standing nearby added, "That's right. The officer has been very polite and hasn't done anything to threaten her. I think she's just trying to start something." Karen began to lose her composure, her initial confidence giving way to unease. She hadn't anticipated that bystanders would step up to defend Michael. The guard's gaze turned stern as he looked back at her, seeming to understand who was truly causing the issue. "Miss Parker," the guard spoke firmly, "it appears we have several witnesses confirming that you are the one creating a disturbance here. I'm going to ask you to stop this behavior immediately, otherwise we'll have to take action." Cornered, Karen refused to back down, raising her voice in defiance. "You can't do this. I have the right to feel unsafe. He's the one threatening me, and I'll sue all of you." But the crowd's support was gone. The passengers around her weren't just annoyed. They openly expressed their disapproval. A woman whispered to her friend, "What a nuisance. It's all her fault." Another man shrugged, shaking his head in frustration. The guard had seen enough. He gestured to two colleagues nearby, signaling them to approach. "Ms. Parker, we're going to escort you out of this area to ensure the safety of everyone here," he said decisively. Karen resisted, trying to free herself from the guards, but they firmly escorted her out, giving her no further chance to cause a scene. Her shouts grew fainter as she was led away, but Michael felt an indescribable tension linger in his heart. This confrontation, marked by hatred and baseless accusations, had finally reached its climax. He stood there, breathing quietly, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. When the guard returned, he looked at Michael with respect, his voice filled with acknowledgement. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Officer Anderson. You handled the situation very well." Michael nodded, trying to conceal the complex emotions stirring within him. "Thank you. Sometimes all it takes is calm." He knew he had passed the ultimate test in this exhausting ordeal with Karen. Despite all her efforts to undermine his dignity, truth, and patience had prevailed. But at the same time, he couldn't help but wonder what had driven Karen to act this way. Her deep-seated hostility and relentless accusations carried a pain he couldn't fully understand. As Karen was escorted out of the airport lobby, Michael knew he had maintained his dignity, enduring every test she had set before him. The surrounding passengers looked at him with sympathy and respect, some even whispering their support. Leaving the airport, Michael felt as if a great weight had lifted from his shoulders. This confrontation may have dragged on and tested his patience to its limits, but in the end, he had won peace and pride in himself. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would always find strength in patience, dignity, and the support of those around him. After the tense confrontation at the airport, Michael tried to return to his everyday life and work, but the incidents with Karen had left a deep, lingering mark on him. Every time he recalled the events, he felt an unprecedented heaviness and exhaustion, Facing constant criticism, harassment, and public humiliation had left a profound wound in his soul. Although he had always tried to remain patient and not be drawn into the anger Karen brought, the hatred and pressure she inflicted left a lasting mental scar that was difficult to erase. During the entire ordeal, Michael felt intensely alone. He had hoped for understanding, but in reality, those who didn't witness the events firsthand were quick to believe Karen's one-sided story. This left him feeling anxious and lost amid a current of rumors and judging glances. Instead of empathy, Michael realized he was at risk of being misunderstood and associated with things he had never done. The fear of being misjudged haunted him, worrying about the potential impact on his reputation and life. Michael's concerns extended beyond the present. He worried about his future. He wondered if this incident would leave a stain on his career and if what happened with Karen would continue to haunt his life and work. This anxiety felt like a heavy weight pressing on his heart, making it hard to sleep well or focus on his job as he once did. After everything that had happened, Michael noticed that his mental state was no longer as stable as before. He felt fatigued and restless. The stressful events and the rumors around them not only hurt his self-esteem, but also took a toll on his mental health. Many nights Michael couldn't sleep, overwhelmed by a flood of thoughts. He felt a decline in his quality of life, as each day seemed shrouded in a gloomy fog. Though he tried to control his emotions and avoid negative reactions, each instance of unwarranted criticism sparked an intense internal struggle. Michael felt as if he were tested daily, forced to suppress the hurt and strive not to yield under the pressure. He constantly reminded himself that responding calmly and rationally was the best way to protect himself. However, that restraint wasn't easy and drained much of his mental energy. One of the thoughts that troubled Michael most after the ordeal was the idea of justice. Despite all his efforts to act correctly and avoid conflict, he was met with misunderstanding and unjust accusations. This made him think deeply about the concept of justice and people's faith in the legal system. Michael used to believe that as long as he acted right, nothing bad would happen. But reality showed him that even when you try to do the right thing, you can still fall victim to prejudice and misunderstanding. During the time the case was being investigated and tried, Michael held on to hope for fairness from the legal system. He hoped that justice would be on his side and would defend what was right and fair. This hope was the only thing keeping him steady, helping him not to give up. Yet, he also had to face the reality that not everyone would understand or empathize with what he had gone through. After all, Michael's deepest wish was to find peace in his life again. He longed to return to days free from pressure, free from surveillance, and without having to face scrutinizing gazes. Michael wanted to continue his life and work without fearing he'd be dragged into arguments or unfair judgments. He understood that to overcome this trauma, he needed to seek support and share with friends, family, or even mental health professionals. Michael hoped to heal and move forward with a lighter spirit, free from the shadows of the past events. For Michael, this ordeal was more than a temporary incident. It was a lesson in patience, self-control, and faith in justice. Though he had endured much stress and hurt, he continued to hold his ground, believing that the truth would ultimately prevail. This journey hadn't been easy, but it had helped Michael grow, allowing him to understand himself more deeply and how the world operates. He hoped that someday this would all be behind him, and he could find peace within. Following the airport incident, the public's attention quickly centered on the story between Karen and Michael. Karen's lawsuit sparked controversy and drew attention from the media and legal authorities. Once the case went public, the court officially accepted it and began a detailed investigation. This was a tense period where even the smallest detail could completely change the nature of the incident. Upon receiving the case, investigators and lawyers began collecting evidence from the airport, including witness statements, video footage, and data from the security system. These initial pieces of evidence were crucial, as they not only reflected the incident sequence of events but also clarified the actions of those involved. Eyewitnesses at the scene provided detailed information. Some testified that Michael's actions were entirely appropriate, which weakened Karen's accusations, as Michael's actions were only defensive, not excessive. The decisive element in the case was the security video that captured the entire incident. This footage, considered undeniable evidence, allowed an objective and accurate view of the situation. With advanced image analysis technology, the investigation team could examine each moment to assess the motives and behavior of both parties. The video showed that Michael only acted when the situation became unsafe and proved he made no first move to attack, rendering Karen's claim of being victimized baseless. Some legal experts even described the video as clear and compelling evidence, capable of refuting Karen's allegations. During the investigation, Karen and Michael underwent intense questioning. Karen maintained that Michael had been threatening and had caused her emotional distress, leading to her decision to sue. However, faced with evidence like the video and witness testimonies, she struggled to maintain her stance. Michael's lawyer, armed with clear evidence, repeatedly posed questions to show that Michael's actions were neither threatening nor harmful. Michael stated that all his actions were aimed at ensuring safety for himself and those around him. His confidence in answering questions reinforced his stance that he had simply been drawn into an unwanted situation. He emphasized that he had no intention of harming Karen and only wanted to resolve the situation quickly and safely. An essential part of the investigation was assessing the psychological state of both parties, especially Karen. Psychological experts were brought in to determine if Karen had experienced stress or pressure that might have led her to misinterpret Michael's behavior. Experts found some indications that Karen might have been influenced by immediate emotional factors and the fatigue of travel. However, they stressed that Karen's subjective feelings didn't mean Michael had acted harmfully. Clearly distinguishing Karen's subjective perception from objective reality became a crucial factor in the final case conclusions. After completing evidence collection and questioning, the investigation team issued a preliminary report stating that no evidence supported that Michael acted excessively or intended harm toward Karen. The report also noted that much of Karen's accusations likely stemmed from emotional responses and misunderstandings in a tense situation. Some team members suggested that the case be handled through mediation, as there was no indication of a serious incident warranting criminal charges. However, the court retained the final decision, and the case continued to draw public interest. When the preliminary report was released, it sparked mixed opinions from the community. Some felt the conclusions were reasonable and protected Michael, who had been drawn into an undesirable situation. Meanwhile, Karen's supporters felt that her emotional distress and psychological tension during the incident should be considered further. Nonetheless, the preliminary report laid the foundation for resolving the lawsuit fairly and objectively. Although Karen had the right to appeal and request reassessment, her chances of winning were slim without additional evidence. With clear evidence from the video and witness testimonies, the case was nearing its conclusion. The parties involved, including lawyers and the court, prepared for the final steps of the investigation and trial. The final decision would be based on existing evidence and the strength of arguments presented during the official trial. The investigation process helped clarify the case's nature, showcasing the legal system's effort to uphold the truth. This lawsuit also reminded the community of the importance of controlling emotions and actions in tense situations to avoid unwanted consequences. Finally, the trial day arrived. When the proceedings began, Michael's lawyer meticulously presented key evidence demonstrating that Michael's actions had been entirely appropriate and reasonable. Witnesses at the scene testified that Michael had done nothing wrong and had only attempted to resolve the situation amicably. Their statements revealed that Karen had continuously caused a disturbance and acted provocatively, escalating the incident unnecessarily. The surveillance footage from the airport's security cameras served as undeniable proof. The video recorded Karen's actions, showing her deliberately making noise and creating a public disturbance, disrupting the peace. All of her accusations against Michael, from alleged intimidation to violent behavior, were dismissed. The video not only exonerated Michael but also clarified the true nature of the incident, placing Karen in a compromising position. Faced with the clear and irrefutable evidence, Karen had no choice but to remain silent. She could no longer fabricate a story that painted Michael as the antagonist in this situation. The court condemned Karen's behavior as dishonest and damaging, not only to Michael's reputation but also for creating unnecessary chaos. Karen was charged with public disorder and falsely accusing an officer on duty, charges that could have severe legal consequences. After considering all factors, the court delivered its verdict. Karen was fined a substantial amount to compensate for the emotional and material damages she had caused Michael. Additionally, the court mandated that Karen attend a compulsory behavior management course to help her understand and adjust her actions in the future. This decision reflected the court's desire not only to punish, but also to educate, to prevent similar situations from occurring. Furthermore, Karen was required to issue a public apology to Michael in court. This was a critical part of the verdict, as the public apology would help restore the dignity and reputation that Michael had worked so hard to protect. In the eyes of justice, Karen was forced to confront her mistakes and accept the consequences. Although Karen had been punished for Michael, the ordeal wasn't easily over. He still carried feelings of emptiness and pain, enduring reminders of the long struggle to defend his honor and dignity. Throughout this period, Michael faced pressure from public opinion and unfair criticism. He felt wounded in many ways, from his self-respect to his faith in social justice. The case between Karen and Michael highlighted the importance of defending one's honor and the need for justice in society. Michael understood that if he hadn't stood firm and courageous, Karen's false accusations might have severely damaged his reputation and life. Winning the case not only restored his honor, but also proved that truth would eventually triumph, even if the path to justice was challenging and prolonged. The trial concluded, but its impact remained with both Karen and Michael. Karen had to face the truth and take responsibility for her actions, while Michael gained invaluable lessons in patience and courage to defend himself against injustice. Although the court had resolved the matter, Michael's journey to heal from these wounds would continue. One day, after the lawsuit concluded, Michael received a letter from the police chief's office. The letter was brief but meaningful, acknowledging the professionalism, patience, and self-control he had demonstrated throughout his ordeal with Karen. The chief expressed gratitude for Michael's handling of the situation, describing him as a shining example of dedication and ethical conduct. Receiving this recognition, Michael felt a lightness in his heart. The hardships and pressures he had endured were finally acknowledged and celebrated, not only by his superiors, but also by the community and his colleagues. Those around him understood all he had been through, and their support felt like a balm for the lingering pain within him. The community began to show strong support for Michael. Many wrote him letters of encouragement and thanks, expressing appreciation for his patience and resolve. They valued the way he handled the situation calmly and professionally, refraining from reacting with anger or violence. Michael's family also offered him enormous support, standing by him through the toughest times and encouraging him to continue on his chosen path. One evening, after work had ended, Michael sat on his porch, gazing up at the peaceful night sky. He felt a sense of peace, but couldn't help reflecting on the experiences he had just been through. The conflict with Karen was not only a mental test, but also left him with profound lessons about life and human nature. Although she had paid for her wrongful actions, the events continued to echo in his mind, reminding him of what he had endured and how he had upheld his dignity. Michael understood that even though Karen had been punished, the wounds from her hateful words and piercing gaze would not fade easily. The cruel words she used to attack him touched a deep part of his soul, where his self-respect and patience were tested to the limit. But through the pain, Michael realized that his patience and composure had strengthened him, helping him not only protect his honor, but also uphold the ethical foundation he treasured. He recognized that each challenge in life made one stronger and wiser. Michael reminded himself that no matter the scars Karen left, he would not let it turn him into a bitter or hateful person. Instead, he would continue to build a life rooted in calmness, dignity, and compassion. In addition to the community's recognition, Michael received support and empathy from friends and colleagues. They expressed admiration for his resilience, and some even shared similar experiences, making him feel less alone in his battle against injustice. Each word of encouragement, every handshake, was like a dose of strength, reminding him that he had allies standing by his side. In a brief team meeting, the police chief publicly praised Michael in front of his colleagues. He emphasized that Michael was a role model for other officers in how to handle situations professionally and ethically, even in the face of provocation and challenge. His colleagues gave him respectful nods, with some patting him on the shoulder after the meeting. That evening, sitting at home with his family, Michael noticed the proud smiles and looks in his wife's and children's eyes. They had witnessed him endure every hardship without losing his patience or professional ethics. As he looked at his wife, he felt her deep support. To them, he wasn't just a husband or father, but a true hero who had faced adversity without wavering or changing his true self. As night fell, Michael sat alone, reflecting on all that had happened. Although everything was over, he knew life would continue to present challenges. But now he was stronger, more resilient, and understood the value of patience and composure. Karen may have tried to ruin his reputation, but she couldn't defeat the character and ethics he had built over the years. What he took away from this experience was a precious lesson in patience, calmness, and the ability to rise above pain. Even though the storm had passed, he knew that the psychological wounds from Karen would still linger. But those scars would also be a source of newfound strength, a reminder of what he had endured and what he could withstand. Michael promised himself that no matter the difficulties ahead, he would always hold on to his dignity, patience, and compassion. He learned that true strength doesn't just come from overcoming challenges, but from turning them into motivation to become stronger and more mature. Concluding his reflections, Michael understood one thing clearly. Justice and truth would always prevail in the end. And, even after overcoming hardships, the most valuable thing wasn't revenge or retribution, but growth and inner strength, qualities that would remain with him, no matter the storms life might bring. The incident between the woman and the police officer on the plane serves as a powerful reminder that justice can appear unexpectedly, and that improper behavior comes with consequences. This wasn't just a personal story between two people, but also a message about respect and equality in modern society. What do you think of the officer's response in this situation? Do you believe his approach was reasonable? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel to catch more meaningful stories like this one. Thank you for watching.
The scent of fine Italian leather and the polished gleam of marble floors filled the high-end boutique as Malcolm Graves, a tall, distinguished black man in his late 50s, browsed through the racks of tailored suits. He moved with quiet confidence, his posture sharp, his gaze observant, habits ingrained from decades of experience. To any casual onlooker, he might have seemed like another wealthy customer, perusing the latest collection of European craftsmanship. But Malcolm Graves wasn't just any customer. He was the director of the CIA, the sales associate, a young woman with sleek blonde hair pinned in an immaculate bun, fluttered nervously nearby. Despite her professional smile, her darting eyes betrayed discomfort. Her fingers hovered over the store's security call button. Malcolm was used to the silent judgments. He'd walked into rooms where men underestimated him, where assumptions preceded his words. It was part of the burden he carried. Yet he never let it rattle him. With a sharp nod, he turned to the cashier, motioning to purchase an exquisite navy blue suit. Just as he reached into his wallet to retrieve his black titanium credit card, a loud, authoritative voice shattered the refined atmosphere. "Put your hands where I can see them." Malcolm turned slowly, his trained instincts processing every detail in an instant. A police officer stood at the entrance, gun drawn. The store had gone silent. The saleswoman stepped back, her fingers clutched at her necklace, while other customers froze in place, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and unease. The officer, a burly man with a square jaw and a buzz cut, looked at Malcolm with pure hostility. His name tag read R. Whitaker. "Step away from the counter, now." Whitaker barked, advancing. Malcolm's eyes remained steady, his pulse as controlled as ever. This wasn't new. Different setting, same ignorance. He raised his hands slightly, but didn't comply with the absurdity of stepping back. "Officer, what seems to be the issue?" His voice was calm, even. Whitaker's lip curled. "I got a call about a suspicious person handling merchandise. Store employees said you've been lurking in here for too long, and now you're trying to pay with a stolen card." He gestured aggressively at the card Malcolm still held. The accusation was absurd. Malcolm exhaled slowly, looking from the officer to the trembling sales associate. "So that's how it was. Sir, if you just take a moment." Malcolm started, but the officer wasn't listening. With zero hesitation, Whitaker strode forward and yanked Malcolm's arm, slamming him chest first against the counter. The shock of impact sent a crystal display crashing to the ground. Gasps erupted throughout the store. Malcolm didn't resist, not yet. His fingers flexed against the counter. His mind worked at lightning speed. Assess, calculate, execute. He could dismantle the officer in seconds if he chose. He had been trained by the best, but now wasn't the time. Not yet. "You think you can just walk in here and steal, huh? You people love doing that." Whitaker muttered under his breath, and just like that, everything changed. The officer's words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, thick with prejudice and ignorance. Malcolm's muscles tensed, but he remained still, his training overriding his instinct to react. The sales associate flinched at Whitaker's remark, her eyes darting between Malcolm and the officer, as if realizing, for the first time, the gravity of the situation. Customers edged toward the exit, eager to distance themselves from whatever was about to unfold. "I'm going to ask you one more time." Whitaker's voice was cold steel. His gun stayed aimed at Malcolm's back, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. "How'd you get that card, whose name is on it?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking onto the officer's face in the reflection of the shattered glass on the counter. He could see arrogance, hatred, and most dangerous of all, confidence. Confidence that no one would question his authority. Confidence that this was just another day of putting a black man in his place. Whitaker grabbed Malcolm's wrist, twisting it cruelly. The pressure was nothing to Malcolm. He had been through CA Black sight training, endured far worse than this, but he let out a slight wince, not out of pain, but calculation. Whitaker smirked. He liked that. "Sir, I suggest you check that card before you make any assumptions," Malcolm said, his voice even but firm. His patience was razor thin, but he wasn't going to give this officer what he wanted. Whitaker scoffed. "Oh, I will, after I take you in, you're done." The click of handcuffs. Malcolm's wrists were wrenched behind his back, and with a swift jerk, Whitaker forced him toward the exit, marching him past stunned customers and silent employees. The weight of every stare bore down on Malcolm's shoulders. Some held pity, some looked away, not wanting to get involved. But Malcolm wasn't just some ordinary man being humiliated. He was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Whitaker had no idea who he had just laid hands on. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Malcolm's wrists as Whitaker shoved him toward the exit. The polished floor, the designer suits, the indulgent luxury of the boutique, all of it faded into the background. The only thing that mattered now was timing. Malcolm could end this in an instant. He knew 100 ways to free himself, 1,000 ways to turn the officer's own weapon against him, but he stayed still, calculating, watching. As the glass doors swung open, fresh air hit Malcolm's face. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, onlookers who had heard the commotion. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and concern. A valet attendant, a woman holding shopping bags, and a businessman stepping out of a Rolls Royce. But Malcolm's eyes locked onto someone else. Standing across the street, parked in a black SUV, was Agent Cole. Cole was ex-military, a high-ranking CA security operative. His job was simple: watch Malcolm's back. Always, and right now, Cole wasn't just watching, he was moving. As Whitaker yanked Malcolm toward his patrol car, Cole's voice rang out. "Officer, unhand that man, right now." Whitaker barely turned his head. "Stay out of this," he snapped, his hand gripping Malcolm's shoulder. "This is police business." Cole's expression didn't change. He reached inside his jacket and withdrew a black leather case. Flick, a badge, but not just any badge, CAA. "That man is Malcolm Graves," Cole said slowly, stepping forward. His voice was smooth, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Director of the Central Intelligence Agency." Silence. The words hit like a bullet. The crowd stiffened. The valet's eyes went wide. The businessman stopped mid-step. The boutique's manager, who had stepped outside, went pale, but the most satisfying reaction of all. Whitaker, he froze. His grip on Malcolm's arm loosened slightly. His jaw tightened. His face twitched as his brain scrambled to process what had just been said. Malcolm slowly turned his head, his sharp eyes locking onto Whitaker's. No words, just watching, studying. The realization was sinking in. The man he had just humiliated, slammed against a counter, handcuffed in front of a store full of people, was one of the most powerful figures in the country. And in that moment, Whitaker knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Whitaker's hand twitched on Malcolm's shoulder, but the grip was no longer firm. It was hesitant. He blinked, processing what he had just heard. Director of the CAA, no way. Whitaker's ego wouldn't let him accept it. His lips parted, grasping for control. "You're lying." He spat at Agent Cole. "There's no way." Cole didn't flinch. He reached into his coat again and pulled out his radio communicator, pressing a single button. "Command, this is Cole." "Confirm. Director Graves' location. Over." The reply was instant. "Director Graves is confirmed shopping at the boutique on Lexington. Security detail reports visual." Whitaker's eyes widened. The radio confirmation was airtight. No confusion, no mix-up. The man he had pinned down like a common thief was the highest-ranking intelligence officer in the United States. Malcolm watched the officer's ego unravel. Whitaker's breath hitched. His pupils darted across the watching crowd, no longer with confidence, but panic. He looked for an escape, a justification, a way to cling to his authority. His fingers still hovered over his gun, but Malcolm saw it in his face. He had already lost. Uncuff him, now." Cole's voice was sharp. Whitaker hesitated. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice measured. "You going to tell me you had probable cause for this, officer, that I looked like I was about to rob the place, or maybe you just didn't like seeing someone like me in a place like this?" Whitaker flushed, but instead of backing down, he made one final mistake. This doesn't change anything. "You were acting suspicious." A scoff escaped from Cole's lips. Suspicious, the director of the CAA shopping for a suit. The officer was unraveling fast. Finally, with stiff movements, Whitaker fumbled for his keys and unlocked the cuffs, his hands shaking. The metal slid off Malcolm's wrists and clattered to the pavement. Malcolm rubbed his wrists, taking his time. He wasn't angry. Anger wasn't necessary. The cop was already destroying himself. Malcolm stepped forward, watching Whitaker crumble. He leaned in slightly, voice just low enough for only the officer to hear. "You just made the worst career decision of your life." Whitaker gulped, because deep down he knew it was true. The weight of consequence settled on Whitaker's face. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breathing shallow. The confidence he had wielded just moments ago was gone, replaced with something new, dread. Malcolm rolled his wrists, feeling the stiffness from the cuffs. He kept his eyes locked on Whitaker, studying him. The man was drowning in his own arrogance, struggling to keep his authority intact, but there was no saving it, not anymore. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A shift had taken place. Whitaker wasn't the one in control anymore. "Officer Whitaker, step away from Director Graves, now." A new voice entered the mix, sharp, authoritative. A second patrol car had pulled up, and stepping out was Lieutenant Avery, a woman in her early 40s with a no-nonsense presence. Her sharp brown eyes darted from the discarded handcuffs on the ground to Whitaker's shaking hands. Whitaker turned toward her, desperate to regain control. "Lieutenant, this is a misunderstanding. The store made a report. I was just doing my job." Avery's stare didn't waver, really. "Because I just got a direct order from the chief to place you under immediate suspension." Whitaker staggered back. "What? No, wait, this is ridiculous, this." Malcolm crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. Now it was happening, the fall. "You assaulted the CA director, Whitaker." Avery stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough. "You realize how bad this is, don't you?" Whitaker's jaw clenched, his face going pale. His eyes flitted to Malcolm, then to Cole, then to the stunned sales associate inside the boutique. Reality was closing in fast. The corporate security cameras had captured everything. The witnesses had seen it unfold. And now there was no way out. "Hand over your weapon." Avery's voice was sharp. Whitaker's breathing quickened. His hands hovered over his holster, hesitating. His last shred of power. Malcolm held his breath for a second, watching the flicker of temptation in the officer's eyes. Would he be foolish enough to resist? A moment passed, then another. Whitaker's shoulders slumped. With a shaking hand, he unclipped his gun from his holster and handed it over. Avery took it, then turned to Malcolm. "Sir, I deeply apologize on behalf of the department. This should have never happened." Malcolm exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. There was still more to come, but for now, he watched as Whitaker stood there, defeated, and it was only the beginning of his reckoning. Whitaker stood there, his hands trembling at his sides, his face drained of color. The weight of his actions was finally crushing him. Malcolm watched the former aggressor shrink before his eyes. He had seen it before, men who believed their badge was untouchable, their power unquestioned, but when stripped of that authority, they became small. Lieutenant Avery turned to Cole, her expression tight with barely concealed frustration. "I assume the CAA will be filing a formal complaint." Cole nodded. "Oh, it's already being handled." He stepped toward Whitaker, his gaze cold. "You think this is bad? You have no idea what's coming." Whitaker stiffened. I didn't." "You didn't what?" Malcolm interrupted, his voice calm, but sharp as a blade. "Didn't mean to slam me against a counter. Didn't mean to put a gun in my face. Or was it the part where you said you people that just slipped out by accident?" Whitaker opened his mouth, then shut it, because he knew. There was no way to justify this. The store manager had stepped outside, her hands wringing together. The sales associate who had called security stood beside her, her gaze locked on the ground. She knew she had caused this, and she knew there was no taking it back. "Lieutenant." Malcolm turned to Avery, his posture still calm, his voice steady. "Let's make this simple. Your officer is going to be arrested today, correct? Avery inhaled, nodding stiffly. Yes, sir, he is. A fresh wave of panic flickered through Whitaker's eyes. His breathing became uneven. Wait. Arrest, come on, let's be reasonable. I didn't shoot him. I was just— You were just what? Malcolm's voice dropped lower, colder. Using your power to humiliate a black man in public. To remind me that, in your eyes, I didn't belong here. Whitaker sputtered. I was doing my job. Malcolm smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You're about to find out what happens when the wrong person abuses the wrong man. Whitaker's knees nearly buckled. The crowd had grown. More people had gathered, phones recording. The irony wasn't lost on Malcolm. Whitaker had walked in believing he had absolute power. Now he was powerless. The same laws he twisted to justify his actions. Now they were being used against him. Avery turned back to Whitaker. Officer Whitaker, as of this moment, you are under arrest for assault, unlawful detainment, and misconduct under color of law. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Whitaker froze. His own handcuffs, the ones he had so confidently slapped on Malcolm minutes ago, were now being placed on his own wrists. The sound of the metal locking into place rang through the air. Malcolm watched it happen, and he felt nothing but satisfaction. Click. The cold bite of the handcuffs against Whitaker's wrists was a perfect reversal of events. The same rigid steel he had used to restrain Malcolm without cause was now locked onto him. The irony settled deep in the air, thick with justice finally served. Whitaker stood frozen, his chest rising and falling erratically. His eyes flickered between Malcolm, Lieutenant Avery, and the stunned onlookers who had stopped whispering and were now openly recording. This isn't right. You're actually arresting me. I was just doing my job. Whitaker spat, his voice laced with panic. Lieutenant Avery, who had remained composed despite her visible irritation, didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. Instead, she gave a simple nod to another officer. Read him his rights. A younger officer stepped forward, his face tight with discomfort as he pulled Whitaker toward the squad car. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, Whitaker thrashed. This is a joke. I'm a cop. I was protecting the store. The store manager, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, finally found his voice. Officer, we never accused Mr. Graves of anything. His voice trembled slightly as he turned to Malcolm. Sir, I sincerely apologize. I should have stepped in sooner. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, watching the man squirm. The apology was weak, too late, too convenient. But Malcolm was used to these delayed regrets. He didn't need them. Whitaker, however, wasn't done fighting for his life. He turned toward Malcolm, desperation twisting his face. You don't have to do this. You're the director, right? You can make this go away. This doesn't have to ruin me. Malcolm took a step forward, lowering his voice so only Whitaker could hear. Ruin you? You ruined yourself. The second you saw me as a suspect instead of a man. Whitaker shook his head wildly, his chest rising in frantic breaths. The arrogance that had dripped from his words minutes ago, it was gone. I didn't know who you were, if I had known. Malcolm's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smirk. That's the problem, isn't it? If I were just another black man, you'd have walked away without a second thought. Whitaker's breath hitched. He had no argument, no badge, no gun, no power. Malcolm leaned in, his voice nothing but a low whisper now. You picked the wrong man, and now you're going to pay for it. Whitaker's knees nearly buckled. He had lost. The younger officer finished reading his rights and shoved him into the back of the police car. The door slammed shut, and with that, Whitaker's fate was sealed. The police car's door slammed shut with a finality that echoed across the boutique's entrance. Whitaker sat inside, his face a mask of shock and rage, his wrists bound in the very cuffs he had so arrogantly used minutes earlier. Malcolm took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders as the tension in the air shifted. The moment of injustice had come full circle, and the consequences were now irreversible. Cole stepped up beside him. You want me to handle the follow-up, press charges. His voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the crowd of onlookers, the ones who had stood by, silent until the scales tipped. The store employees, the manager, the privileged customers who had watched it all unfold like a show. He had seen it before. This wasn't new. It was just louder this time, more visible. He wasn't naive enough to think one arrest would change everything. But he knew the power of an example. Malcolm looked at Cole, his expression unreadable. "Oh, we're pressing charges, but that's just the beginning." Cole nodded once. He had expected that answer. Lieutenant Avery approached, her shoulders stiff, her expression neutral. But Malcolm could see it in her eyes, a quiet understanding. "Director Graves," she said carefully, "I can't erase what happened here today, but I can promise you this won't be buried. He'll answer for what he did." Malcolm held her gaze for a long moment before finally giving a slow nod. "Make sure he does." Avery turned and headed back to her officers, the weight of what had just happened pressing on her shoulders. As the police car pulled away, taking Whittaker toward the station, toward the reality he had so easily handed to others, Malcolm exhaled. Justice had been served, but the fight wasn't over. He stepped toward the boutique's glass doors, pausing only for a moment. The manager flinched slightly as Malcolm met his gaze. The blonde sales associate, the one who had made the call, stood frozen, shame written all over her face. Malcolm said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply walked back inside, head held high, stepping over the shattered glass of the display Whittaker had destroyed, because in the end, the only thing broken here today was a man who thought he was untouchable. I pulled into my driveway after a long shift, the weight of exhaustion pressing on me like the heavy Kevlar vest I had taken off just 20 minutes earlier. The sun was setting behind the rows of neatly trimmed hedges and cookie-cutter homes, casting long shadows across the perfectly paved streets. My neighborhood had always been quiet, the kind of place where people smiled politely, but never really knew each other. It was the kind of place where the worst crime reported in the last year was a teenager leaving his trash cans out for too long. That's why I was more than a little surprised when I saw a man standing at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed, a stern expression carved into his weathered face. He was dressed like a cop, at least, that's what he wanted people to think. He had a navy blue polo with a shiny badge pinned to the left side, cargo pants that looked like they'd never seen a day of real work, and a utility belt that was trying too hard. No gun, no radio, just a flashlight hanging awkwardly from the side. His stance was stiff, authoritative, like he had been practicing it in the mirror before marching over here. I knew the type before he even opened his mouth. As soon as I stepped out of my car, he took a step forward. "You can't park there," he announced, jerking his chin toward my driveway like I had somehow made a mistake pulling into my own property. His voice had that nasal, self-important tone that made me immediately brace for nonsense. I arched a brow. "Excuse me, this is private property," he continued, oblivious to the fact that I was the homeowner. "HOA regulations state that vehicles must be parked inside the garage overnight. You can't leave your car in the driveway. It's a safety violation." I stared at him, waiting for him to realize the absurdity of what he was saying. My car was parked perfectly in my own driveway. It wasn't blocking the sidewalk, wasn't spilling onto the street, wasn't even close to another house, but he stood there like a sentry, watching me with the smug confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. "That's funny," I said, setting my bag down on the hood of my car. "I don't recall that being a rule." "Well, it is," he said, puffing up like a rooster in a henhouse. "I should know. I'm with the HOA Security Patrol." I almost laughed, almost. There was no HOA Security Patrol. There was an HOA, sure, but they barely managed to send out their quarterly newsletters, let alone hire some bootleg cop to enforce nonsense rules. I glanced at the fake badge pinned to his chest. It had a little eagle on top, the kind you could buy in bulk from a party supply store. "So, let me get this straight," I said, folding my arms. "You're telling me that I can't park my own car in my own driveway." "That's correct," he said, nodding firmly. "And what happens if I don't move it?" His lips curled into a smirk, as if he had been waiting for this question. "Then I'll have to issue a citation," he said, reaching for a notepad that had clearly been printed at home. "And if you refuse to comply, I will call for backup." I tilted my head. "Backup? Yes," he said, narrowing his eyes. "And if necessary, I can place you under citizen's arrest." Oh, this was getting good. I let a slow smile creep onto my face, feeling the exhaustion from my long shift fade away. This was going to be fun. I leaned against my car, folding my arms, and gave him the kind of look you give a toddler when they proudly tell you they're the president. "A citizen's arrest," I repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "That's right," he said, straightening up as if he had been waiting for this moment all his life. His fingers hovered over his cheap notepad like a gunslinger ready to draw. Failure to comply with HOA regulations is a direct violation of community safety standards. As a designated enforcement officer, I have the authority to detain non-compliant residents until proper action is taken. I almost applauded him for the confidence. He really believed this nonsense, and yet I knew exactly what this was about. He didn't recognize me. That much was obvious, but it wasn't just about the car. It wasn't about some imaginary rule he had pulled out of thin air. It was about me. The way he looked at me, the way his lips curled just slightly downward when I spoke, the way he squared his shoulders like he was gearing up for a fight. I had seen this all before. It was the same routine, the same tired act, the same kind of man who didn't expect people like me to live in neighborhoods like this. I kept my voice calm, steady, and just so I understand, I said, tilting my head, "If I don't move my car, you're going to arrest me." "That's correct," he said without hesitation. "I strongly suggest you comply." He expected me to fold, expected me to apologize, maybe even expected me to get angry so he could pretend he was dealing with a hostile individual. He was waiting for me to react the way he wanted so he could escalate this into whatever little fantasy he had in his head. But I didn't give him that. Instead, I smiled. "All right," I said, nodding. "Go ahead." That threw him off, his brow furrowed, his grip tightening around his notepad. "Excuse me," I gestured toward him. "Go ahead, arrest me." He hesitated, just for a second. And in that second I saw everything, the flicker of doubt, the realization that I wasn't afraid, the sudden concern that he had played his hand too soon. "Well," he cleared his throat, "I need to make a formal report first." "Of course," I said, nodding seriously. "You'll need to document everything. After all, this is a major crime, right?" Parking in a driveway, his lips pressed into a thin line, I took a slow step forward, letting him really take me in. I wasn't in uniform, but I carried myself like I was. Old habits, the kind of confidence that made real criminals nervous. "You know," I continued, "it's interesting. I know every actual law enforcement officer in this jurisdiction, and I know there's no HOA security patrol. But you," I gave him a pointed look, "you're out here flashing a badge and talking about arrests. Now, I could call my friends over at the department, but I wouldn't want to waste their time with, well, whatever this is." He swallowed, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I don't think that'll be necessary." "No," I raised a brow. "That's a shame. I'm sure they'd love to hear about someone impersonating an officer." That hit him like a slap. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching around his fake citation book. He wanted to argue, wanted to push back, but he had lost control of this encounter the moment I didn't react the way he expected. And now, he was stuck. He blinked a few times, his mind racing for a way out, but I could already see the panic settling in behind his eyes. His entire act had been built on the assumption that I would fold, that I'd get nervous, that I'd back down. But I wasn't going to give him that. Instead, I leaned in just slightly, lowering my voice to a calm, almost amused tone. "You know," I said, "impersonating an officer is a serious offense. You're walking a very fine line here." His lips parted like he wanted to argue, but I saw the hesitation. I saw the flicker of doubt. I never said I was a police officer." He blurted out quickly, "I'm with the HOA enforcement team." I tilted my head, staring at him. "You threatened to arrest me." I said citizen's arrest. He corrected, trying to stand his ground, but his voice was less confident now. I nodded. "Right, and you're using a badge, a uniform, a citation book. You're pretending to have authority you don't actually have." I took another step forward, watching him swallow hard. "That's impersonation. And depending on how convincing you were with anyone else in this neighborhood, that could be considered fraud. Now, tell me." I crossed my arms, my voice dropping just enough to make him nervous. "How many other people have you pulled this little stunt on?" His face twitched, and I knew I had him. He didn't answer, didn't need to. I could feel the regret rolling off him in waves. He had probably done this to other people, other homeowners, maybe people who didn't have the patience or knowledge to push back. Maybe he had bullied someone into paying a fake fine or moving their car out of their own driveway. And now he had run into me. I let the silence stretch, let him squirm. He was breathing heavier now, eyes darting slightly as if searching for an exit strategy. His hands clenched into fists, but I saw the way his fingers trembled. Look, he finally muttered, trying to regain control of the conversation. I'm just doing my job. No, I corrected. You're pretending to have a job that doesn't exist. He clenched his jaw. I don't have to explain myself to you. I smiled. You don't. But you will have to explain yourself to the actual authorities. That landed. His entire body stiffened, his face shifting into something between fear and anger. He was weighing his options, trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I wasn't. You're full of it, he finally snapped. You don't even know who I am. Oh, I know exactly who you are, I said smoothly. You're a guy with a fake badge, a fake ticket book, and a real big problem. I could see the conflict in his expression. He wanted to keep pushing, wanted to hold on to whatever power he thought he had in this situation, but the cracks in his confidence were showing. Tell you what, I said, straightening up. Why don't we call someone who can make arrests? I'd love to see how they feel about you running around threatening people with a badge you bought online. I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocking it with a single tap. He took a half step back. That won't be necessary. Oh, I insist, I said, my smile widening, and that was it. The moment he realized he was cornered, the moment he understood he had messed with the wrong person. His face turned a shade paler, his bravado cracking like thin ice under the weight of reality. He licked his lips, shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking anywhere but at me. I don't think we need to escalate this, he muttered, his voice losing that artificial authority he had been clinging to. Oh, I think we do, I said, keeping my phone in my hand. I wasn't actually dialing anyone yet, but the idea was enough. I wanted him to feel the pressure, the same way he had likely pressured other homeowners into compliance with his nonsense. After all, you were about to put me under citizen's arrest, right? If that's the case, we should get some real law enforcement involved. His jaw clenched, and I could practically see the thoughts sprinting through his head. His scam had worked before. Maybe he had never been challenged. Maybe he had bullied a few people into following his imaginary rules and walked away with a false sense of power. But he had picked the wrong house, the wrong person. You know what? He said quickly, throwing his hands up as if this was all one big misunderstanding. I'll let it slide this time. I let out a low chuckle. You'll let it slide? He nodded, all too eager to retreat now. Yeah, I'll just give you a warning. How generous, I said dryly. He took another step back, his fake badge catching the glow of my porch light. His whole stance had shifted from authoritative to desperate, like a magician caught mid-trick. His act was unraveling fast, and he knew it. Have a good night, he muttered, already turning on his heel. I let him take a few steps before speaking again. Oh, one more thing. He hesitated, shoulders stiffening. What? I smiled. What's your name? He turned just slightly, his eyes darting away. It's, he paused for a beat too long. Not important. That's what I thought. I let the silence hang there, let him feel it. He knew I wasn't scared. He knew I wasn't some easy mark. And now he knew that he couldn't pull this stunt again, at least, not in this neighborhood. Get off my property, I said, my voice low, firm. He didn't need to be told twice. He scurried off down the sidewalk, shoulders hunched, moving faster than someone trying to casually walk away should. I watched until he disappeared around the corner, then let out a slow breath, shaking my head. What a joke. I grabbed my bag from the hood of my car, ready to finally get inside and unwind after my shift. But as I reached for the door, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A neighbor, an older woman from a few houses down, was standing just inside her porch light's glow, watching the whole thing unfold. She caught my gaze, hesitated for a moment, then offered a small, knowing nod. Yeah, I had a feeling I wasn't the first person he had tried this on, but I would damn well make sure I was the last. I stood there for a moment, gripping my bag, watching as the called HOA enforcer, disappeared into the night. My adrenaline was still high, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of it all, the nerve, the entitlement, the complete and utter fabrication of his authority. I let out a slow breath and turned toward my neighbor. She was still watching me from her porch, arms crossed over her chest. Her graying hair was tied back in a loose bun, and she had that look, one I had seen before on people who had been through too much and had long since run out of patience for nonsense. She hesitated before stepping off her porch and crossing the lawn toward me. That guy's been around before, she said, her voice low, wary. I saw him last week telling the Johnsons they needed to repaint their mailbox or face fines. She made air quotes with her fingers. Told them the HOA would charge them $500 if they didn't comply. I frowned. Did they pay him? Her lips thinned. They were going to until Mr. Johnson called the actual HOA and found out there was no fine. I shook my head, disgusted but not surprised, and no one reported him. She gave a humorless chuckle. To who? The HOA barely answers emails, and the police aren't going to rush over for some guy playing dress up unless he actually takes someone's money. I glanced back in the direction he had vanished. How many people do you think he's scammed? Her expression darkened. More than just the Johnsons, I bet. I've seen him walking around before, talking to different people. He targets the ones who don't push back, the ones who are new or quiet, or just don't want trouble. She let out a frustrated sigh. I wanted to say something, but he never came to my door, and I figured maybe it wasn't my place. I shook my head. It's everyone's place when someone's out here pretending to be law enforcement. She studied me for a moment, then asked, "You handled him like you've done it before." I smirked. Something like that. She narrowed her eyes, curious, but didn't press. Well, I appreciate you calling his bluff. He's been strutting around like he owns the place. I thought for a moment, then pulled my phone back out. You said the Johnsons almost paid him. She nodded. Then we do have something to report, I said, already typing. Attempted fraud. If he's been doing this for a while, he's going to slip up eventually. And when he does, I want an official paper trail that he's been warned before. Her face lit up with satisfaction. Now that is something I can get behind. She stepped a little closer, lowering her voice. You know, I bet if you asked around, you'd find more people he's harassed. If we get enough complaints, maybe someone will take notice. I nodded, my mind already working through the possibilities. If this guy thought he could push people around without consequences, he was about to learn otherwise. Appreciate the info, I told her. She gave me a knowing smile. No problem, neighbor, and hey, next time he tries something, let me know. She cracked her knuckles. I'd love to have a word with him myself. I chuckled, shaking my head as she turned to head back to her house. One thing was certain, that fake HOA cop had just made the worst mistake of his life. I spent the next morning knocking on a few doors, starting with the Johnsons. They were an older couple, retired, the kind of people who still left baked goods on doorsteps and waved at everyone who passed by. Mr. Johnson answered the door with a wary look until he saw me standing there. "Oh, you're the one who sent that guy packing last night," he said, rubbing his chin. "Saw the whole thing from my window. Gotta say, it was satisfying." I nodded. "Yeah, well, I found out he's been at this for a while. I heard he tried to get you to pay a fake fine." Mr. Johnson's face darkened, and he opened the door wider. "Come on in." Inside, the house smelled like fresh coffee and cinnamon, and Mrs. Johnson sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a newspaper like it was still 1985. She looked up as I walked in and gave me a polite smile. "You're here about that phony security guy, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I want to file an official complaint, but I need statements from people he's harassed. The more, the better." Mr. Johnson scoffed. "That guy's been parading around like a cop for weeks. Came up to us waving that fake badge, saying we owed the HOA $500 for non-compliant mailbox paint. He shook his head, told him I'd talked to the HOA directly, and he got real pushy, started throwing around words like citations and escalation fees." Mrs. Johnson huffed. "It's beige. What kind of non-compliant nonsense is that?" "Did you report him?" I asked. "Tried," Mr. Johnson grumbled, "but HOA about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. They sent back some boilerplate response about how all enforcement measures are handled through official channels." He snorted. "Which means absolutely nothing." I nodded, my suspicions confirmed. "Did he ever ask for money directly?" "Oh, he definitely hinted at it," Mrs. Johnson said. "Kept saying things like, 'If you handle it now, I can make sure it doesn't go on your record.'" She made a face, as if there's some kind of criminal record for mailbox colors. That was what I needed, an actual attempt at fraud. "If I write down a statement, would you two be willing to sign it?" "Absolutely," Mr. Johnson said without hesitation. I pulled out my notepad and jotted down the details as they talked. When I was done, they both signed at the bottom with the kind of confidence that comes from years of knowing right from wrong. "Thank you," I said, slipping the paper into my folder. "I'm taking this to the local authorities. If enough people report him, they'll have no choice but to act." Mrs. Johnson patted my arm. "Good. Someone needs to take that man down a peg." I smiled. "That's the plan." After leaving the Johnsons, I spent the next few hours collecting statements. The more doors I knocked on, the more stories I heard. The fake HOA cop had been making his rounds, targeting the elderly, new homeowners, and people who didn't speak up. Some had ignored him, but others had been intimidated into paying fines on the spot. By noon, I had a stack of signed complaints, enough to take to the local authorities. I sat in my car, flipping through the pages, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. That guy thought he could play pretend. He had no idea who he had messed with. I drove straight to the local sheriff's office, a small brick building with a few squad cars parked out front. It wasn't my jurisdiction, I worked at a higher level, but I knew how these things worked. A case like this, with multiple signed statements, was something they had to take seriously. Inside, the air was cool, and the receptionist barely looked up from her computer as I approached the front desk. "I need to file a report," I said, setting the folder down. She glanced at it, unimpressed. "What's it about?" "Fraud, harassment, and possibly impersonating a public official." That got her attention. Her eyes flicked up to me, then to the folder. "Hold on." She picked up the phone, spoke briefly into it, and within minutes a deputy walked out from the back. He was younger than I expected, mid-30s, with sharp eyes that took me in the way a professional does, assessing, measuring. "I'm Deputy Hensley. You said you had a fraud case." I nodded and opened the folder, spreading out the statements on the desk. "There's a man walking around my neighborhood pretending to be some kind of HOA law enforcement. Fake badge, fake citations, even threatened to make a citizen's arrest when I didn't comply." Hensley's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's so." I tapped the statements. "He's been doing this for weeks, targeting older residents, new homeowners, people who won't push back. Some even paid him fines because they thought he had real authority." Hensley whistled low. "And you got this many statements. I have more, if needed." He leaned against the counter, flipping through the pages. "Normally, these HOA scammers are tricky. They don't always demand money directly, so it's hard to prove fraud, but this guy, he's gotten greedy." He pointed to one of the statements where a homeowner described handing over cash to avoid further penalties. That's enough to bring him in." I crossed my arms. "So what happens next?" Hensley gave me a look that said he appreciated someone who knew how to cut through the nonsense. "We'll run some checks, see if he's got a record. Then we'll put out a notice to the neighborhood. If he's still out there pulling this stunt, we'll bring him in for questioning." I nodded. "Good, because he's not just some overzealous HOA guy. He's a predator." Hensley exhaled through his nose. "Sounds like it." He reached for a clipboard. "Can I get your statement, too?" I smirked. "Of course." As I filled out the report, I felt something shift. That fake HOA cop had been so sure of himself, so convinced that no one would stand up to him. But now, he was about to learn that pretending to be the law has real consequences. A week later, the neighborhood was buzzing. It started with a notice from the sheriff's office, printed on crisp white paper and slipped into every mailbox. The bold letters at the top read, "Warning, fraudulent individual posing as HOA security. Report any contact immediately." The notice detailed everything: the fake citations, the unlawful demands for money, the threats of citizens' arrests. It urged residents to come forward with any additional information and to not engage with the man if he attempted to enforce any regulations. That alone was satisfying, but what came next was even better. The following afternoon, I was pulling into my driveway when I saw him, the fake HOA cop. He was standing on the sidewalk, stiff as a board, staring at a sheriff's deputy, none other than Deputy Hensley, who had him in a very real conversation. Another deputy stood nearby, arms crossed, as if waiting for an excuse to escalate things. I cut my engine but didn't get out just yet. Instead, I watched. The fake cop's whole demeanor was different now. Gone was the puffed-up confidence, the smug smirk, the empty threats. He was defensive now, his arms rigid at his sides, nodding rapidly as if trying to explain his way out of it. Hensley, to his credit, let him talk, for a minute. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a notebook, flipping to a page. "We've got multiple reports of you demanding payment for fake violations." "Want to explain that?" The fake cop's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I was just enforcing community standards." Hensley tilted his head, unimpressed. "Funny. The HOA says they've never heard of you. Well, I mean, and this." Hensley held up a laminated card, the fake badge. "This looks an awful lot like a law enforcement badge to some people." I never said I was a cop, fake HOA stammered. You threatened to arrest people. Citizens arrest, he corrected weakly. Hensley sighed. Do you know how many scam reports we get a year? Do you know how tired we are of guys like you walking around pretending they have authority? You really thought no one was gonna call you out? The fake cop swallowed hard. I was just trying to keep things in order. By shaking down old folks for cash, silence. Then Hensley took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that I had to strain to hear. You're lucky, he muttered, because you almost crossed the line into a felony. You got people to think you were official. You made them pay you. If we can get just one of them to testify that they felt coerced, that's fraud, impersonation, and extortion, and that would mean jail time. I saw the fake cop's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed. I didn't mean any harm. That's not up to you, Hensley said, his voice firm. He gestured to the other deputy, who stepped forward. Here's what's gonna happen. You're going to leave this neighborhood. You're going to stop harassing people. And if we hear even one more report of you trying this anywhere else, he patted his radio, we'll make sure your next badge is an inmate number. The fake HOA cop's face was pure humiliation. He didn't argue, didn't push back. He just nodded, his hands twitching at his sides like he wanted to shove them into his pockets, but was too afraid of making any sudden movements. Then, finally, the deputy pointed down the street. Go. And he did. I watched as he walked, fast, like he was afraid to run but even more afraid to linger. Hensley caught my eye as he turned back toward his squad car. He smirked slightly, tipped his head, then got in and drove off, and just like that it was over. I let out a slow breath, then grabbed my bag and headed inside. The next day I got a knock at my door. It was Mr. Johnson and a few other neighbors. Words out, Johnson said with a grin, Everyone knows what you did. I raised an eyebrow. What I did? You stopped him, one of the younger homeowners said. People were scared to speak up before, but you didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us. I smiled. I just don't like bullies. Well, neither do we, Mrs. Johnson added. And after seeing what you did, we're gonna make sure nothing like this happens again. We're starting a real neighborhood watch. I crossed my arms, impressed. Now that is a good idea. Hope you don't mind, Johnson said, but we were kind of hoping you'd help us set it up. I laughed. Oh, now you want my help. Johnson shrugged. Hey, you ran off a fake cop. That makes you overqualified. I looked at the group in front of me, the same people who had been intimidated, tricked, or afraid to push back. And now they were standing together, ready to make sure it never happened again. I nodded. All right, I said. Let's do it. And that was how the real HOA patrol started. No fake badges, no phony citations, just people looking out for each other. The way it should be.